So these are just a couple examples to help you think through this notion of validity. And as I said earlier, most of the arguments that we use in science, they're not deductive arguments. So you're not really talking about valid arguments. Pretty well all the arguments, not all, but most of the arguments in science they're inductive. Remember, inductive arguments, the premises don't completely support the conclusion. So in these inductive arguments, even a good inductive argument could still be a bad argument. In fact, it's still invalid because it could still possibly be the case that all the evidence we have for Einstein's theory of general relativity, for instance, doesn't turn out to support that theory. There might be some new evidence come in tomorrow and disconfirms it. So this idea of a good argument is a rather elusive notion to capture. So even a sound argument may not be a good one, could be trivially sound, trivially valid. We've seen valid arguments that no one would accept. We've seen valid arguments passed off as good arguments, but they could be propaganda and pretty hateful stuff at that. So you got to be careful about that. So what's the upshot then? What's the point of all this discussion of arguments? Well, one is you need to have a good understanding of them. You need to have a little bit of logic under your belt. You need to have an understanding of how validity and soundness and induction works in order to make sense of good reasoning, poor reasoning, deceptive reasoning, all these kinds of things. And also, last but not least, as I said way at the beginning, arguments aren't true or false. Ultimately, they are valid, sound, and now we've seen they can be trivially valid, trivially sound. Premises are true and false. Arguments, ultimately, what we're looking for are good arguments. And good, the notion of a good argument there's really, at the end of it all, there's no simple way to say what's a good argument. Understanding validity, understanding soundness, understanding deduction, induction, truth, falsity of premises, inferences, all these concepts, to understand them will help you figure out what good arguments are. But there's no, shall we say, there's no like little magic wand where I can say, here's 5 things to check, or here's 2 things, or 10 things. Check that, and if you check off all the boxes, you can be sure you have a good argument. Oh, if life were that easy. It doesn't work that way. So what's going to be a good argument? Yeah, it's going to have good reasoning. It's going to be true premises. You're going to be looking at that. But that isn't an absolute guarantee that you've got a good argument. So we can't say in advance, what exactly a good argument means. And that's one of the big lessons that you find when you study philosophy and a lot of other disciplines too, is that terms we commonly use, like, that's a good argument, are very easy to use, but it's very difficult to say exactly what a good argument is, right? Sometimes we can put some forward and say, yeah, we're pretty sure this is a good argument. But if someone says, well, in general, what do you mean by a good argument? That's surprisingly hard to theorize. Lots of ordinary terms are difficult to theorize. St. Augustine, one of his famous statements in his Confessions is, I use the word time all the time, but don't ask me to define what time means. So in thinking about arguments and analysis, critical thinking, reading and writing, nothing is self-evident, right? You have to keep your wits about you and think about this stuff you're reading, and think a lot about what you're trying to say, and be critical of your own work. And not only is it easy to get tripped up when you see a valid argument, and you might think it's sound, or you think some inductive argument might look pretty good, but actually it's not a really well supported one either. You have to keep your wits about you about arguments in other terms as well. Sometimes there's arguments that really look good. They could be sound or they could be valid, but they're kind of like counterfeit arguments, and those are often referred to as fallacies. But that's jumping ahead right now. We'll look at fallacies in a later video, but for now, the notion of a good argument, Sometimes you can recognize them when you see them, but it's very difficult to lay out completely in advance what constitutes one so that you have some simple little checklist to go through. There's just no substitute for keeping your wits about you when you examine academic works and ultimately try to write them yourself.